welcome everybody to Bradford Literature Festival online and their digital schools program this year. I'm Jean Menzies and I am with the incredible, I'm doing this, you're over here. I'm getting used to the space with the incredible Kiran Millwood Hargrave, best-selling award-winning author of 5 novels, is it now?
Yeah, it keeps going up.
It's amazing, and I'm sure you've got more in the works. And also poetry. You have written children, young adults, and poetry, and I'm kind of in awe right now of all of that. It's amazing. And I also realized that a lot of your poetry is based on mythology as well, so you've got a background in retellings.
Yes, it's always held enormous interest for me, like myths initially, and then how can we retell them?
Yeah, and that's obviously what we're here to talk about today, which is the Deathless Girls inspired. I don't want to call it a retelling because it feels more like a prequel to Dracula by Bram Stoker, one of the sort of Gothic classics. So I guess for people watching, I thought an interesting place to start would be to learn about your introduction to the sort of Gothic literature genre, whether it be through Dracula. Was it in school or was it elsewhere in the world?
So when I was 16, my mum organised for every member of the family to give me their favourite book. And they all wrote why it was their favourite book inside. And there were 16 books in total, obviously. And one of them was Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. And this is actually, so that was given to me by my mum. But this is actually an edition my dad recently found in a derelict building that had been ravaged by fire. And this was just lying on the floor. So it's definitely haunted. Like, I am certain this edition is haunted. If you've read the book, it takes on a whole new meaning that those are the circumstances. But so Rebecca, I would say, was my earliest introduction to the Gothic and to this idea of, the house as a locale, or the castle, which is so significant in Gothic literature, and the idea of this this kind of brooding male hero, if you like, and then this sort of helpless woman. But obviously Rebecca subverts a lot of those stereotypes already, so it's already starting to play with the Gothic. And then at school we looked at Jane Eyre, and that's obviously a very famous work of Gothic literature, but through Jane Eyre I came to the Wide Sargasso Sea. So that's when I started to realize there are always two sides to every story. We'd been introduced to Bertha as the mad woman in the attic, but how did she get there? So from sort of my mid-teens, I have been interested in hearing that other side of the story, and knowing that villains aren't always clearly villains. So that's what interested me.
I actually love that you brought up Wide Sargasso Sea, because in a way you're sort of following in Jean Rhys's footsteps by writing this set before the events of a classic Gothic novel.
Yeah, that's exactly where that's exactly where I got the idea when I was approached to write this, because it's part of a wider series of stories that take as their start point male authored classics, and then they tell them from marginalised characters' points of view. So obviously I've taken Dracula as my male author classic, and I did consider writing something that was sort of parallel with the events in the novel, but actually that didn't hold as much interest for me. What I really wanted to do was claim these characters, these dark sisters, the brides of Dracula, for myself, just as Jean Rhys claims Bertha. Sorry, my cat's just walking in my periphery, so I'm just a little distracted. There she goes. So that was completely an inspiration for making this. I've come to call it an origin story as opposed to a retelling.
I mean, so you chose Dracula then when you were approached by Hachette, as opposed to them going, will you write a prequel to Dracula for us?
Yes, so they gave a really open brief. So the other author that they have is Kit Duvall, who's an incredible writer, and she did Moby Dick, but she's completely subverted it. So the brief's really open, and it's lovely because they're really trusting authors to think, what would interest readers? How can we come at this from a really inventive way? So it's a really exciting thing to be a part of.
And that was your first young adult novel. You previously written 3 children's novel, and I know now you have an adult novel as well, but
yeah.
How did it differ writing young adult? Particularly, I always feel, having read the book now and absolutely adoring it, but it maintains that darkness. It doesn't feel like you've purposely lightened the mood or anything for a new audience. So just how was it different writing a young adult novel and adapting a Gothic novel for the young adult?
I've always continued to read young adult fiction, and sort of I think my love of it was ignited by writers like Mallory Blackman and with Noughts and Crosses, or Jamila Gavin with Coram Boy. So I've always been interested by writers who look at those characters on the margins of history, or reimagine well-worn narratives. That's always been something that interests me, and how I think YA is so brave in the way that it tackles things like issues around race, around gender. You know, you've got writers like Juno Dawson who are really forging the path, talking about trans rights, and you just don't have that equivalent yet in any other area of literature. It really feels like YA writers and YA readers are the most open-minded and most willing to take on these bold stories and really move our society on. Like, this book is set in historical times, but I'm trying to open a conversation around sexuality, around race, around prejudice. So YA felt like the perfect opportunity to really be brave and tell a story like really boldly.
I love that interpretation / summary of young adult, because there are those that would sort of dismiss it, whereas I think anyone who actually reads within it realizes how radical it is.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And YA as a classification didn't really exist, but I think a lot of classics would be like fall under the sort of the cloak of YA. So, you know, I think it's really great that now that label has been claimed, and I think fewer and fewer people are dismissing it, which is really important, because people have always dismissed what teenagers like teenagers are used to being overlooked and being told, you know, you're too young to have a stake in the world. But that's just nonsense. And we've seen that, you know, with the climate change protests, it's teenagers who are changing the world, unfortunately, because adults who should be doing it aren't.
Yeah, no, 100%. And actually, in a sense, sort of some of these like popular genres that we read now that were classics in their time were often dismissed at the time. With some of the Gothic classics and early Gothic novels, they're sort of popular literature, not that.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, heaven forbid someone enjoys it.
Oh no, literature's not for enjoyment, imagine. But it's incredible because you can create an enjoyable novel like you have with the Deathless Girls that like burrowed deep within my soul and I like has stayed with me, that at the same time has such serious topics and like such insightful things to say. You can definitely do both. I think your book is a testament to that. One of the things I thought was really interesting though, because what you've done is you've written this origin story for the 3 sisters that appear in the Dracula novel in the sort of early parts and the end parts, and then have been picked up throughout popular culture and described as the brides of Dracula. Were you influenced by sort of films or other retellings of Dracula and the way they're represented there in the way you decided to tell their story?
Absolutely. And this is the moment when I horrify everyone listening and admit that I had not read Dracula before I came to write this book. Which is terrible, but it's true. And so actually the way I had encountered Dracula and encountered Dracula's brides is through film and television, and, you know, the Buffy episode where they show up briefly, and Charmed, and obviously the Dracula film. I was obsessed with Winona Ryder when I was growing up, so I watched that version of the movie. And, you know, the brides just kind of like, they're just objects. They're just objects of curiosity. They're sexy. They kind of just drift on being, I don't know what this is, like sexy.
Captures it.
And then they drift off and then they get killed. Like they're just tools to demonstrate the carnal instincts of a vampire. Like they don't have an interesting arc. They don't have history. And when you go to Bram Stoker's novel, again, they're described so briefly. So there's two dark, one fair. Two of them have the dark have high aquiline noses. So it's as though they're related. And when I saw that, when I went to the page and saw just that they were still just this gap, this silence in the book, I knew I'd found the perfect thing to write into. And him describing them as too dark, he might have meant dark haired, but I interpreted that as them being women of color. And sort of went from there. And I found a really interesting link, because my two main characters, Kizzy and Lille, they are members of the traveller community. And the traveller community originate in the Punjab region in northern India, which is where my mum's family is from. So I've always been interested, and there's evidence that my family sort of travelled in our genealogy. So it was always interesting for me. And then I discovered that I wasn't going to have to force this link, because Vlad the Impaler, who actually inspired Dracula, had hundreds of thousands of slaves and tens of thousands of slaves who were travelers. So that link sort of cemented it for me that this was the right story to tell, and that it was being true to the text whilst also being able to make it very much my own story.
And you're writing something inspired by a fictional, fantastical story, but your retelling feels very rooted in a historical period. And I wonder how you went about researching to create this very atmospheric, realistic environment.
So I did want, and something actually I want with all my stories, even when they are high fantasies, I want them to feel grounded in reality and like they could have happened at some point. And that was important for this. And luckily, Romania, which is where it's set, is actually, holds so much of this history still. The forests are still hugely intact. The castle that inspired Dracula's castle is still there. I didn't actually get to go, but Google Maps was brilliant. That satellite version, I was zooming right in, and actually it is because Vlad the Impaler holds such dark, macabre fascination. There is actually a lot of historical detail around the way he lived and the way that the people around him were treated. It's not nice reading, but it felt important not to kind of switch it over into something camp and high drama, because these are things that actually happened. And maybe vampires don't exist, but if they did, this is how this man was certainly horrifying enough to be inhuman. So it felt important to get that balance right of that kind of high horror, but also it feeling realistic and possible, and therefore a warning about what happens when people are too powerful and things like that.
Yeah, you're right. It never verges into sort of parody horror. It's very dark, but in the best possible way. And I felt like my heart was really pounding throughout it, because the characters are human as well. And I thought it was such an interesting decision that you decided to tell the human side of their story pre-vampire, pre-transition. And I wondered why you had decided to do that.
A few readers have been really disappointed that it kind of stops at the point when they become vampires. But I did that because I feel like we have the vampire stories. We know what happens then. And I do, there's a Wardstones edition that has a bonus chapter where I do describe their lives as vampires, because that holds interest for me too. Like I love a good vampire novel, but that wasn't ever what I was setting out to write here. What I was trying to talk about was prejudice and love, like first love, and really human desires and human failings. And and family, and vampires don't care about that stuff. So none of it never was going to be a vampire novel, because I felt like I knew that story, and I'm interested in telling stories that I don't know. So that's why I decided to make it very much about the human elements, as opposed to the supernatural. And of course the supernatural's there, and you get to learn like the reasoning behind them becoming vampires and all that sorts of things, but yeah, I was just more interested in it being a story about sisters and things like that.
That was one of my favorite things about it. I love the aspect of it. And it's interesting because you have created such like complex, real characters for the reader in Kizzy and Lille. Yet, like you said, there's so little of them in the original material. Where did those characters come from?
It's always part just drawing on what I think the story needs to move it forward. You know, what do the characters need to be to inhabit this story and make it come alive for the reader? But in this book, more than any other, I think, that I'd written, I brought in people that I knew. So Kizzy and Lille are vaguely based on the two of my best friends who the novel is dedicated to. So Kizzy is sort of like Saravat. She's very beautiful and sort of forthright and fierce. And then Lili has some elements of me in her willingness to kind of be a background character and sort of sit back, and also this fierce noticing quality that I think is so overlooked as a quality in people, but it's something that my other best friend Daisy has, where she just really, when she looks at you, she sees you, and she has this ability to really read people and this deep empathy. So it was a sort of homage to them and to friendship and sisterhood. And even though, you know, the dedication says to my sisters in all but blood, and I really believe that friendships can be that strong, they can be that linked, that they are just my family. So it was kind of honoring them a little bit more than I would in usually I'd sort of just make them up.
Yeah. I love that. Well, I think it worked.
Yeah.
Also, another one of my like favorite elements of the book was Lil's relationship that she develops with one of the other slaves that is from the settlers rather than a traveler background. And I wondered why you decided to include that sort of first romance as a part of the story.
I love first romance. First of all, there's just the self-indulgence of when you're writing a book, you're writing for yourself as well. You are your first reader. You have to be in love with what you're writing. So I will always introduce elements that interest me into books. And YA, this being my first novel that wasn't for children, allowed me to have romance in a way that I hadn't before, because 10-year-olds don't care. Like, that's the age when they're like, boys are smelly, girls suck, you know. It's so there wasn't that sort of ability to explore that side of life, which is so important. And the character of Mira, which is an homage to Mina in so she is a slave and she is settled, and it felt really important to, what I'm always trying to do is decenter the kind of colonizers' viewpoint, and decenter whiteness in particular. So this story is told from Lil's perspective, and she is a traveler. So to her, the settlers, the people who don't move, are the strange ones. And so it felt really important to have a representation of the settled. Both you have them from the villain standpoint, like Mistress Malowski and, you know, the horrible soldiers and things like that. But you also have this more sympathetic character in Mira. And, you know, because class is such an important part in oppression, as well as race and gender. So it felt important to show that, you know, power can be wielded over anyone, you know, and Mira is an exploration of that, and also an opportunity for Lil to grow as a person and to become a woman. You know, she's always in her sister's shadow, and then for the first time she meets this this person who sees her before she sees Kizzy and sees her for who she is, and that allows her to sort of step into her power, if you like, to use an Oprah term, and all the positive things that love can give you. You know, I read a lot of books where love seems more like abuse, and sometimes that can be romanticized, but I really wanted this to be a wholly positive experience for her.
It's true. I do find myself reading a lot of books where the romantic side of things does err on the kind of negative, and like less, not the relationships you want.
Yeah, like might be fine to read about, but not so good to be in.
Yeah, Mira and Lille, I can totally aspire to, minus the vampire thing.
Yeah.
It's incredible because your book is full of so many like complex, strong in different ways women. It's beautiful. The central characters are all different, but they're all women, and they all have these really complex personalities. And in contrast with that, it feels like Gothic literature often contains a lot of like tropes and stereotypes of sort of maybe one or two types of women, and often they're fainting, or they're the opposite, and they're like the sisters in Dracula, where they're sort of seductresses, objects. And I wondered how you sort of balance that. Like, was your novel a reaction to that in any way?
I think everything I write is a reaction to anything that puts restrictions on gender in either way. Like, I want to write soft boys and hard women. Like, I want to really, you know, celebrate the differences in people and the range of different kinds of people. And that's why, you know, Mistress Milovsky, who is a huge antagonist in this book, but she too is caught within this system that in its own way renders her powerless. And, you know, those tropes you're talking about, there in Dracula, you've got the kind of pure sort of virgin, and then you've got the whore. Like, you know, you've got those two things that are constantly, that have been going since the Bible. That those are the types of women that you can have. And so it felt really important that Milovsky, for example, used to serve like as one of the serving girls in the castle, and her looks faded, and so she's been sent away. And so, you know, it's showing the damage that can do, you know, when you're placed within a system that puts your only currency is your looks. That's dangerous. You know, when you reduce people to only one thing, that's dangerous, and that's going to create divides and anger and fear, and those are all like very toxic things.
You did, and not just with Mistress Milovsky actually, but I felt like that throughout the book, even with sort of soldiers and the way, I don't want to like give away any spoilers, but there's some like soldiers later on in the book, and you can very much tell why they're acting the way they are, because they're just trying to survive as well. And was it important to you to sort of show how like people get pulled in to oppressing others and contributing to that oppression?
Absolutely. I'm always striving to deepen my own empathy and my own understanding, because I think as soon as you start hating someone, then the negative stuff has won. Like, you know, even when I was at school, so I was bullied at school quite badly, and it was only as I got older that I understood that this was the only power this person felt like they had, was to have power over me. And, you know, as soon as I started standing up to it, it stopped, because they needed to pick someone who wouldn't stand up to it. And it's because they were being made to feel powerless in their own lives by their superiors, or whatever, in this case, a parent. So there's always a story like behind the malice. And I'm not saying that we should therefore feel sorry for people, because some people just act in a wholly inexcusable, hateful way. And I think it's actually dangerous to excuse certain levels of behavior. But it is so important to understand it, because if you can understand it, you can you can argue against it, and B, you can prevent it from becoming cyclical and passing on that damage. And really what you see in the castle that Kizzy and Lille get taken as slaves to is this cycle of damage that everyone is caught up in, from the guy at the very top, the Boyar, who's like the lord of the castle. He is incredibly ill, like physically ill, and has this sort of terror of death, and therefore it sort of that has made him cruel. That terror has made him cruel. And then you go through the soldiers who have been brutalized into becoming brutes themselves. And I'm so fascinated by how people turn into monsters. You know, how does that happen? And really that's what this whole book is aiming at, is why do Kizzy and Lille make the decision that they make? And actually that's a spoiler, but I'm always interested to hear,
isn't it?
Yeah, I'm always interested to hear what readers think of that, of the ending, which obviously isn't a spoiler to say they become the Dark Sisters, but the reasons, the point is the reasons they make those decisions. And plenty of readers agree that it was, you know, the right decision, but plenty don't, and that's always so interesting to me as a writer.
It sort of makes it feel even more like you've created a real environment where people have opinions because they're so invested either way.
Yes, that's how to frame it. Yeah.
Was there a specific reason that you chose to do 2 sisters and not 3, given that there's 3 in the book?
Yes. So originally there were 3. One of the characters became the 3rd sister.
I wondered if there was someone that I kept wondering, is she going to also...
Yeah. But there needed to be some redemption in this book. There needed to be a sacrifice. And actually the biggest sacrifice in the end was that person not becoming the 3rd sister, and actually being, and that's what you would do if you truly loved someone, is you'd let them go. You know, it's a cliche, but if you are damning yourself, you're not going to drag them down with you. That's not romance. That's just abusive and hateful. So it didn't feel like the right decision for this book. And I wasn't, to be honest, one of the things about being a writer is you can kind of be selfish, and I just wasn't interested in once that became apparent, I wasn't interested in that 3rd sister. I was so interested in these 2 women. And there wasn't space in the story for anyone else. And I sort of allude to it in the aftermath, the sort of the final chapter, the process, and then obviously in the extra chapter, in the paperback edition, you learn a bit more about that 3rd sister. But yeah, it was really not where the heat of this story lay, and I didn't feel like the point of this book was to answer all the questions that Dracula poses. I felt like I had very specific things I was interested in, and I was just committed to doing the best that I could for those characters.
There's so many elements of Dracula, you can sort of never be done writing retellings of it, can you? There's something for everyone.
So rich. And I think, you know, what this series, Bellatrix series of the retellings, really isn't trying to do is in any way undermine those classics, because actually we're writing from a place of huge respect. And I think you can have huge respect and admire things whilst also accepting they're problematic. And people are so sometimes forced into being so black and white that actually you can say Dracula is just a great book, but it's also representations of women are incredibly limiting. So yeah.
Is there themes in general in Gothic literature where you're like, I love that theme, I want to write a book with that theme, whereas then there's themes where you're like, I kind of hate that theme and want to undermine it?
Yeah, I mean, the brooding, when I was researching Gothic literature, sort of when I first decided that this was the book, and I thought, what are the tropes? I need to know them in order to play with them and things like that. And one of them was a put upon man. And I just loved that. And you immediately get that sort of that picture of that sort of straight backed Bronte mad, like sort of like sighing, like, oh, these women are so dramatic. And I loved that and my rebuttal to that, I suppose, is Fen in this novel. And he is just joy, like he's such a good person, and he is put upon by these two sisters. He is put through the ringer by Kizzy, who he's obsessed, like not even obsessed, but in love with. Like he truly sees her as she is. So it's not even an obsession. Like he's just thinks she's beautiful. It's he loves her inside as well. And so he's kind of the opposite of the put upon, and more Kizzy takes on that role of being like, oh, I'm the object of so much fascination. And so I enjoyed playing around with that particular trope. And something that I really love and will do in future fiction is that setting of one place, because obviously in my novel at the beginning they're traveling, so they're in the forests, and then they get taken to this castle, and then they move to a second location, so it turns into more of a quest. I would love to really sink into that Gothic setting of just, you know, the castle on the hill, the lightning, like that would be brilliant.
Creepy things around every door and corner, like
it's just because it's so satisfying as a reader. I love those books, even when they don't put a twist on things, and I would always hope to put a twist, but even when they don't, I always find them so satisfying. So
there's still something in the sort of like original format that is just appealing.
It's just great storytelling.
Is there any other sort of, well, not even just Gothic novels, but classic novels that you would maybe approach to write a retelling now, having done it once before?
So one of them is not my idea, so I cannot do this, but one of my favorite writers, Catherine Arden, who wrote The Bear and the Nightingale, we were talking when I was first approached to do this. We just went for coffee when you could go for coffee. Do you remember that?
No.
It's amazing. And she was saying, oh, do you know what would be good? Would be The Hunchback of Notre Dame. How good would Esmeralda from The Hunchback of Notre Dame be? That would be so incredible. And I think another one, I'm just looking at so I don't know if this counts as a classic, but another book I really love is 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And I would love to write from the female character, like the female line, because it follows the male line of a family through 100 years, and I would love to write like the female line through 100 years, because the men are nightmares in that book. It's just, it would be so much fun. So yes, I probably won't do either of those things, but I would like to.
Well, I'm going to keep an eye out in case this 100 Years of Solitude appears on sort of like this sort of Twitter, because I'll be reading that. Was there anything, like we mentioned at the beginning, you have done some poems retelling sort of mythology, but was there something that you sort of learn in the process of writing a retelling or an origin story that you would maybe pass on to somebody else who was sort of tackling that project?
So I think a really key thing is voice, and really listening for that voice when you're thinking about that character. You know, what are their experiences? And you might be having to come up with those, because they literally might be a cipher in a book, and they might not have any thoughts on the page, so it might be all like coming from you. But I think really listening to that voice, because I think we're all the sum total of our experiences, and so what are the experiences that person has? What does their point of view look like when they're standing across from that main character that we're used to seeing? What's their view in the world? So it would definitely be about listening for that voice. So one of my early poetry collections was a sequence of poems from the point of view of Eurydice or Eurydice, from the Orpheus and Eurydice myth. And, you know, how would it feel actually to be married to this quite self-obsessed genius? Like, he is undeniably a genius, but how does it feel to be reduced to the muse in someone's story? And I'm obsessed for this reason with things like Hamilton, which do such interesting things about what it means to not be the main character in your story, and the damage that can do, and the jealousy that can wreak.
It's interesting actually, because throughout the novel, like Lille and Kizzy, you've got Lille as the narrator, but almost Kizzy is the character that you expect to be a protagonist. She's the sort of one that fights against people, who's very loud, and everyone notices her, whereas Lille is the sort of quieter twin. She's sort of just trying to survive, and like you said before, is almost often in Kizzy's shadow. Why did you decide to write the book from Lille's perspective?
This is a theme that you will spot across all my books, is that I always write from the sidekick's point of view. It just interests me more. I felt like, again, I'd read that book about that really confident, beautiful, self-possessed girl. What about her best friend? You know, that's who I'm interested in. And you know, right from my very first novel, The Girl of Ink and Stars, the real go-getter is actually the best friend. She isn't the one that you're hearing the story from the point of view of. And that's just been a theme that's continued in my work. I'm more interested in the quiet ones. You know, what are they thinking? And and how do sidekicks, you know, how do they reclaim their narrative, and how do they find their way through the world? How do they step out from those shadows? And maybe it's a self-fulfilling thing as well. Like, I certainly wasn't popular at school. Took me a while to find my people, and I certainly didn't feel like a main character in my story for a lot of my life. And I suppose maybe it's about reclaiming that space and that voice, most importantly.
What's lovely though is that you do that magnificently, and you sort of give Lil this central role, but equally you still maintain a really positive relationship between Kizzy and Lil. Was that important to you?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, stories are full of women who hate each other, and that just isn't my experience of life at all. My friendships, male and female, are just such a source of joy and light and support in my life that I really thought it was important. And again, this is a theme of all my books, you know, friendship between women and girls is always highlighted, because that is, for most of us, the experience. You know, we're not being pitted against each other for the attentions of a boy most often, or, you know, we're not competing. We are coexisting, and we are lifting each other up. And so that felt like a really important thing to represent.
I'm thinking as well that those watching right now in the future, in this time as an illusion setup, are potentially having their very first like exposures and experiences of reading Gothic literature, and something like I've felt similarly about with maybe like sort of ancient literature is that I got a lot of my first introductions to that through retellings. So I just wondered how you feel about sort of people starting with retellings, and sort of how that can like build up a relationship between the reader and the originals.
I think it's brilliant. I mean, I came to Dracula through TV. Like, I'm hardly going to condemn any way that people choose to have their stories told to them. And I always call myself a storyteller, because that is what's most important to me, is storytelling. And I don't care if people get that from books, from audiobooks, from comic books, from TV, from film, from music. It's all stories. And if that does ultimately lead you back to the root material, the classic, then that's only going to deepen your enjoyment of both that classic and what you'd read before. So I think it's fantastic to come at things however suits you. I came to most classics, now I'm just remembering this now, I came to most classics through comic book versions of them that my mum used to buy really cheap in India. Like, literally, what's the Hound of the Baskervilles, and The Man in the Iron Mask, all these books, Tale of Two Cities, just in graphic novel form. And I've since read them. Crime and Punishment, like, I would never have read Crime and Punishment. It's like this thick if I hadn't read it as a graphic novel first. So I think it's great.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, size is definitely, I mean, that impacts which books I pick up first.
Yes.
On that note, actually, do you have any other sort of favorite Gothic retellings, even in film or literature?
Favorite Gothic retellings? I'm trying to think. Like, obviously, the Wide Sargasso Sea is spectacular, and and it's so short, which shouldn't really be a factor, but at the moment my like attention is at a premium, so shorter books are really drawing me in. Some of my favorite books are less retellings and more riffs on Gothic literature. So I love Frances Hardinge, and she wrote A Skin Full of Shadows. So this is the proof cover. This isn't what the cover looks like, it's way prettier, but it's so dark and swoony and brilliant. And actually all of Frances's work is so strange and beautiful, and I really recommend it if you love that kind of feel. Also, I don't know what they're putting in the water in Ireland, but Irish writers are killing it at the moment, especially around things like witchcraft. So this is Perfectly Preventable Deaths by Deirdre Sullivan. Sarah Maria Griffin is my nemesis, which apparently means you're obsessed with them. And actually, I think I just want her to be my friend because she's so good. And this book is just beautiful. So V. Schwab, who's one of my other favorite writers, said this book has a fierce and fearless heartbeat, and it's absolutely that. It's just, she's just completely beating her own drum in this book. And so I think there are so many interesting like contemporary takes on Gothic fiction that aren't relying on that structure of an existing text and are just forging their own path. And I think that is so exciting.
And I 100% feel like Deathless Girls falls into that category as well.
Thank you.
It was absolutely phenomenal. I loved it. But I'm also aware that apparently technology constrains us to 45 minutes. And it is verging on those 45 minutes. So I don't want to keep you too long. But thank you so much. That was so insightful. And I, for one, feel like I both have like a new appreciation of Dracula and a whole new layer of information about your novel that makes it just like all the more meaty. It makes me want to go back and reread it.
Thank you so much.
And I would also say I listened to the audiobook, and the audiobook is so good.
Oh my gosh, she reads it so beautifully. It's absolutely amazing.
Very atmospheric. Well, thank you so much for joining me to talk about Gothic literature and the Deathless Girls for the sort of digital schools program for Bradford Literature Festival this year. It was amazing.
Thank you, Jean. It's been lovely.